I then turned to dealing with Joel Quenneville and Kevin Cheveldayoff. The report laid out what witnesses said, some consistent, some inconsistent on various points, but it did not draw conclusions as to credibility. Therefore, as a matter of due process, I needed to meet in person with both Quenneville and Cheveldayoff so that I could best and most fairly decide what was appropriate in terms of a league response. As it relates to Kevin Cheveldayoff, I made clear on Friday that I do not believe he bore any responsibility for the club's failure to act appropriately. There seems to be some confusion, and if I was not previously clear on that, I apologize, but there seems to be some confusion on the point of whether, despite his lack of power, position, or seniority, he should have felt free to speak up. But because of his limited authority and circumstance, he left the meeting believing that this matter was going to be investigated by his bosses. And when Aldrich parted ways with the team, he thought that was what had happened. Kevin was not in a position either to be made aware of or to access additional information about what was going on after the May 23rd meeting, and he did not have such information.
Perhaps for both of you, I wonder what you think it says about the culture of hockey that even though Kevin Cheveldayoff's role at the time didn't rise to a threshold that you feel deserves further sanctions, but he's been a GM for 10 years, and the fact that at no point for a decade that he thought to mention to either of you that this event happened, that he was part of a meeting where these allegations were raised. And even if he thought that his boss had taken care of, the fact that it never came up in a conversation with either of you for 10 years, do you find that troubling at all? Or what kind of message do you think that sends?
Well, first of all, he thought the matter based on his position and the information available to him, and the fact, as I said, that Aldrich subsequently departed the organization, he thought it had been fully resolved by the people that he reported to. Kevin was such a minor player in this, and we discussed this with Reed Shar, who did the investigation for Jenner and Block, that if I have this correct, and Bill will correct me if I'm wrong, when they were doing the investigation, the only person who placed Kevin in the room for the May 13th meeting was Kevin. Everybody else either forgot or didn't acknowledge that he was there. He had been with the Blackhawks for 9 months. He was an assistant general manager with fairly limited responsibilities. This was not something that he not only had no responsibility for, that based on what was available to him in his minor, relatively position at the time, he had no reason to believe that anything other than the right things were going on.
The only thing I'd add is the report did not suggest what exactly was said at that meeting. It's clear they talked about an inappropriate relationship, but the extent of that relationship and what was involved, according to several people at that meeting, was not raised. So Kevin wouldn't have had reason to know how significant an event we're talking about happened.
Gary, you mentioned with Kevin Cheveldayoff that he believed that this matter had been handled coming out of that meeting. Did you question him then about the fact that Brad Aldrich was back in some capacity with the team as that summer and even into the fall in terms of his day with the Cup and participating, and what to make of the fact that wouldn't Cheveldayoff have been aware of that and wondered how was this handled when he was still around the team?
I don't believe that they had very much interaction. Also, Kevin, again, believed that the matter had been appropriately taken care of because he wasn't aware, as Bill indicated, of what the exact nature of the allegations were relative at the time to what it ultimately came out to be. Kevin was in a position where he didn't have access to information, and he had no reason to believe that what he had seen or known had been dealt with any way other than appropriately.
Hey guys, just returning to the idea of Kevin Cheveldayoff and his, to your point of view, lack of knowledge, his belief that supervisors were looking into it, all those sorts of things. As I understand it, Aldrich did remain with the team in the coming days. So despite them not interacting, an AGM will know who is on their staff necessarily, right? So I'm wondering, moving forward in that situation, what is a person's responsibility in a situation like that to speak up and ask questions regardless of title?
You have to look at every situation on a case-by-case basis. Kevin's principal duties at the time were the salary cap and scouting. He was not having that level of interaction. And again, remember, his boss and his boss's boss, he believed, were investigating and taking care of it. He had no basis to know what the conclusion was. And he was advised, I think 3 weeks later, that Aldrich was leaving the organization. He didn't know on what basis or anything else. It wasn't within the scope of his authority, which is why I had to sit with him, talk through, judge his credibility, and which is why all of these things have to be done on a case-by-case basis. Every hockey ops president, every team president, every general manager, every assistant general manager, on each club, every job description is different. So don't be completely misled by the title. I am satisfied, and I was after talking to Kevin and understanding everything that I needed to know about the situation, is what was going on was beyond anything in his world that he could deal with.
Thank you, Murat. Next question comes from Jeff Hamilton of the Winnipeg Free Press. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Gary. The basis of your decision regarding Kevin Cheveldayoff and absolving his role was strictly based on his position within the organization and spoke nothing to the moral and ethical duty we all have in speaking up and following up on these allegations. A fact that was driven home in 1996 with Sheldon Kennedy, who was a member of your league at the time when he came forward. You mentioned some reasons why. Only he knew he was in the meeting. The details weren't overly specific, despite Cheveldayoff saying in the report that he understood explicitly the allegations that included unwanted advances. But with these claims of defense, are these at all based on opinions of experts in this industry of people who look after abuse?
I believe, based on what was available to Kevin and what he did and did not know, that he had no responsibility for this. It wasn't a question about speaking up. It's not a question of values. You can't speak up and be focused on values on things you don't know about. He didn't know, and he didn't have access to the information. What he did know led him to believe that it was being dealt with appropriately.
Let's go to Scott Billick of the Winnipeg Sun. Go ahead, Scott.
Thanks. Gary, I think there seems to be some confusion here. So when it comes to Kevin Cheveldayoff's role in this, did he know something differently? Was he told something differently than the other 6 guys in that meeting? Or like you kind of absolved him of what he knew, or what his role was, but what was shared in that meeting then that was different for him than it wasn't for the other guys?
Well, there are differing recollections as to what took place in that meeting. I think that what's clear is the only speaking part that I think Kevin had is they asked him if he knew anything about it, and he said no. And he left that meeting believing it was going to be taken care of by his bosses. And that is my best judgment based on what I've taken away from the report and my conversation with Kevin. And as I've said, and I said in the release, I wasn't going to paint everybody with the same broad brush, because not everybody was in the same circumstance and situation. And I think it would have been, listen, the easiest thing would have been to simply impose punishment on Kevin, or maybe have Kevin in a position where he thought he might want to resign. But I didn't think that would be fair or appropriate under the circumstances. People may differ with that, but that's the judgment I had to make, and that's the judgment I did make.
Thank you, Scott.